Reclassing and unit customization are common aspects of Fire Emblem today, but for many years, Fire Emblem characters had pretty limited unit customization. Fire Emblem 2 had the villagers whose classes you could pick, 3 and 5 had items that could manipulate growths, 4 had inheritance so you could customize the children units by thinking about how you pair up their parents, and all of the games have stat boosters and items, which are at their core a form of unit customization. But this is a pretty far cry from modern Fire Emblem where units are often able to get into any class, changing their stats immediately, providing different weapon types, new skills, and new class growths. Flexible reclassing has been a staple of the series since Shadow Dragon, and each iteration of reclassing has had some pros and cons because it changes a little bit every game. Let's take a look at reclassing in each game and how they stack up, including games with no reclassing at all. Prior to Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones, there was no reclassing outside of guidance class selection for the villagers. For the most part, units were stuck in the class they joined in and were locked to specific promotion paths. So Oswin, for example, is stuck in Armor Knight and promotes into a general no matter what you do. There are a few pros to not having reclassing and making units stay in the class they join in. One is that it makes a unit's class an important part of their character. A unit like Oswin being an Armor Knight is perfect for him. He's a reliable, tough defender of Hector. Armor Knight feels great for that role. Units being locked to specific classes is also an interesting balancing lever for each character. You can give a character with good stats a weaker class to balance them out. Taking Oswin again, he has great combat stats that allow him to contribute, but his limited mobility stops him from being a second dominant unit along with Marcus. If you were allowed to reclass him into Cav, his stats would have to be weaker, but since he's locked to low movement, it's fine for him to have great stats. No reclassing also means that you can worry a lot less about class balance and how each class impacts map design. Class balance is less of a concern with no reclassing because the developer controls how many of each class the player has. Wyverns being stronger than other classes isn't such a big deal if the player only gets one halfway through the game. This also makes it easier to design maps because you know the maximum amount of tools a player can have. For example, if you're designing side objectives for a map and you know the player only has one flyer available to them, you know that you can use things like impassable terrain to challenge the player. In contrast, if you don't know how many flyers they have, this is more difficult. A player with no flyers will hate a map with impassable terrain, while a player with many flyers won't be challenged at all. Of course, you can still design great maps in games with reclassing, it's just a little more challenging since you don't know what tools are at the player's disposal. So to me, those are the main perks of games not having reclassing, but there's a couple notable downsides as well. One is simply that there's less player choice in these games. In games with reclassing, players get to make meaningful decisions early and often, and making meaningful decisions is fun. Deciding what classes are good for each unit and how many of each class you want for a given map can be fun and interesting to think about, and you lose that with no reclassing. Additionally, reclassing adds replay value while allowing you to use the same units. In early Fire Emblem games, if you want to use a different composition of classes for your team, you need to use a bunch of different characters, perhaps including some that you don't like or that are weak. If you want to use multiple knights in Fire Emblem 7, for example, you're stuck using Wallace for the second one, even though he's pretty weak. In more recent Fire Emblem games, you never really need to use a unit you don't like long-term or a unit that's weak just to get a class that you want. Our first taste of class customization came in the game after Fire Emblem 7, Sacred Stones, and it introduced split promotions. Each base class in Sacred Stones had 2 Tier 2 classes that they could promote to. For example, a Cavalier could promote into a traditional Paladin or the bulkier Great Knight, instead of only being able to promote into Paladin like they would have in previous games. The game also introduced 3 trainee units who have 4 possible endgame classes instead of 2, so there's even a little more customization for them. This system adds some flexibility without giving the player complete freedom. In theory, this could make for some interesting decisions. When you promote Molder, you need to decide whether you would rather him be a sage or a bishop, and you have to think about what your team needs when you make these decisions. In practice, though, most of the promotion choices aren't very close. Molder always wants to be a bishop, mages almost always want to be mage knights, knights want to be great knights, and so on and so forth. Still, some of the weaker promotion options can still be fun when you want to mix up your playthroughs and try new things. One interesting dynamic that's introduced by this system is that early units have a niche where they get to pick their promotion option, but pre-promotes have it selected for them. For example, if you wanted to use a Mage Knight in Sacred Stones, you'll have to use an unpromoted unit like Ewan or Lute, because our pre-promoted anima user comes as a Sage. This doesn't change any unit evaluations much, but it is some added flexibility for unpromoted units that pre-promotes don't get in Sacred Stones. Overall, Sacred Stones manages to add a little customization without sacrificing unit uniqueness or letting you go completely wild with your team compositions. In theory, I think it's a nice system where a meaningful decision is added without overwhelming the player or creating a situation where the player can stack up one or two broken classes. But when you actually play the game, the choices really aren't that close most of the time, so it's a fun system, but it would be better if the promotion decisions were a little closer in power because it would make them a little more interesting. After Sacred Stones, we have Path of Radiance, and Path of Radiance doesn't really have different promotion paths for most units, but some classes have to make a decision when they promote. One of these classes is the Cavalier. At base, Cavaliers only have one weapon type, but on promotion they get to pick one more to learn. For example, Oscar is a Lance Cavalier, but when he promotes to Paladin, you get to choose for him to gain axes, swords, or bows. Similarly, mages choose between knives and staves on promotion. That one's pretty much a non-decision. If you train a mage, you always want staves. In many ways, staves kind of feel like your reward for raising an unpromoted mage, as your pre-promoted sage option has knives. So if you want a sage with staves, you need to raise your own. While many classes in Path of Radiance don't need to make a choice on promotion, the choices that exist serve a similar role as Sacred Stones promotions, except I think they're a little more meaningful. The weapon choice for Cavaliers feels more interesting to me than most Sacred Stones class choices, and staves on a sage is an actual reason you might choose to invest in an unpromoted mage in some playthroughs, compared to Sacred Stones where you probably wouldn't train loot just to get a mage knight unless you were just doing it for fun. So the pros and cons here are very similar to Sacred Stones, there's just fewer decisions to make, but I would argue they're a little more important. The first game with really flexible reclassing was Shadow Dragon and its sequel New Mystery of the Emblem. In these games, each unit has a set of 5 or 6 classes they can switch to during battle preparations in most chapters, and there's no cost to do so, but there is a limit to how many of each class you can have. For example, in Shadow Dragon, you can have a maximum of 10 Paladins on your team by the end of the game, but only 6 Draco Knights. You would expect these class limits to limit mostly the powerful classes, but oddly you can have more Draco Knights and Paladins than Swordmasters, which you can only have 4 of. I guess they thought Swordmasters had it too good for too long. In practice, the class limitations have never stopped me from doing whatever I wanted, as long as I wasn't trying to have a team made up of entirely 1 or 2 classes. The big pro of this system is that it's an insane amount of flexibility and player choice. You can reclass as often as you want and into multiple classes per character. This leads to some interesting ideas like turning Wendell into a Draco Knight for his surprisingly good combat, or changing your flyers into paladins on an archer-heavy map. Reclassing can have long-term implications too since it impacts your growths. A common choice in Shadow Dragon is to level a unit in general for a while to boost their defense. Alternatively, if you just want to meme or do funny builds, you can do things like turning your clerics into swordmasters or turning your mages into armors. Sometimes seemingly weird reclassing options can even have some merit. This system has 2 major downsides. First, it does limit unit uniqueness. In a game where units have a lot of class options and no cost for switching between them, units are basically just defined by their stats, weapon ranks, and character. There's no personal skills in this game, and most characters don't have much dialogue, so if 2 units have similar stats and the same class set, then the only meaningful difference between them is their portrait. A second issue with this class system is that since anyone can be any class balance can become a problem, depending on your class set. The Cavalier class set is the most unbalanced one, where units will probably want to spend most of their time in the Draco Knight class. The reclassing system also has some weird effects on unit stats, particularly in the early game. The best example of this is Navarre, the early game Myrmidon you get that most people expect is a bit of a speed demon, but actually most of his speed comes from his class, so if you reclass him out of Myrmidon, he ends up slower than most of your other units, and if you reclass other units into Myrmidon, they're often faster than him, which just feels weird and unexpected, and there's a similar effect to this on a lot of early game units that are in a class that excels in a certain stat. Your early game Armor Knight, for example, has 0 personal base defense, so he's actually pretty frail if you step out of Armor Knight with him, and other units stepping into Armor Knight will suddenly be more bulky than him. One other factor that I don't like about Shadow Dragon's reclassing system, but that isn't necessarily an issue, is that the player never has to commit to a reclassing decision. In a lot of games, you pick a class for each unit based on an assessment of which class is going to be most useful to you for the rest of the game, or at least until you have another reclass item to use on them. This makes for interesting trade-offs. Putting a unit in a flying class may make them strong on most maps, but there could be a few archer-heavy maps where they struggle. Which maps are easy for you and which ones are hard will depend partially on how you built your team. In Shadow Dragon, you just reclass your units into whatever class is best for the map, and you don't have to worry about it. The only thing you really have to worry about is units can end up struggling with their weapon ranks if you reclass them frequently into classes that don't share weapons. Still, despite my issues with this system, Shadow Dragon has the most flexible reclassing system in the series, and if you want to bounce around constantly between classes, experiment with all of them, or reclass your entire army, this is the perfect game for that, since other games usually make you spend a resource to reclass your character. But for me, the trade-offs in unit uniqueness and the lack of long-term consequences for your reclassing decisions make me not a huge fan of this particular reclassing system. The 3DS era of Fire Emblem kicked off with Awakening, and it restricted reclassing a little bit more than Shadow Dragon did. Each unit in Awakening has 2 class options in addition to their base class that they can switch into. However, unlike Shadow Dragon, there are some restrictions for when you can do it. The first is that you need a second seal item to reclass. Fortunately, these are fairly abundant. You get several throughout the course of the game, and randomly spawning Ana shops and renown rewards can provide you opportunities to get more. Since second seals cost money and you don't always have access to an unlimited supply, particularly in the early game, you have to decide who your highest priority units are to reclass because you don't have enough seals to reclass everyone all the time. This makes reclassing decisions have some long-term implications compared to Shadow Dragon where you can just reclass whenever. Units having 2 reclass options each provides multiple options for each unit without erasing the differences between each units. In some cases, a unit's reclassing options can even be a nod to something about their character. For example, Rickon looks up to Chrom, so he has the same reclass options as Chrom. Kellum often goes unnoticed by allies and enemies, so he can reclass into a thief. Awakening's skill system adds another interesting wrinkle to the reclassing system. Units can pick up skills from each class by leveling up in them. This means that in addition to reclassing having a cost, you're also incentivized to stay in a class long enough to learn its skills if they have a good one. I really like Awakening's reclassing system, especially as it applies to children units where you influence their reclassing options based on the parents you choose for them. Attaching reclassing to an item means that you can't just do it whenever you want, especially at the beginning of the game, but there are enough in the mid to late game that you get to be pretty flexible with your team compositions. Units also have a limit to how many classes they can reclass into, which helps them feel distinct since every unit can't be in every class. Awakening's reclassing system is a nice happy medium between really restrictive games with limited or no reclassing and games with totally unrestricted reclassing. Fire Emblem Fates expands on Awakening's system. In Fates, units have 2 class options by default in addition to their base class, but they can also gain more by S-supporting another unit, at which point they can reclass into their partner's class or secondary classes if they share a base class. Similarly, if you A+ support a character, you can use a friendship seal to reclass into their class. Seals are finite in the early game and are a non-negligible expense in the late game, so you want to make your reclasses count in Fates. Functionally, Fate's reclassing makes it so that most characters can become most classes, but you might have to work for it. For example, if you want a Conquest unit to become a ninja, the easiest way is to S-support or A+ support Kaze so that you can reclass into his classes. However, growing 2 supports with the same unit at once can be tricky. Skills also return from Awakening, and since reclassing is the main source of acquiring skills, you really benefit from planning your reclasses meticulously so that you know what classes you want your units to be in. It's often useful for a unit to bounce between a few classes to pick up some important skills for a build. For example, in my current playthrough, Laszlo is going through Bow Knight, Falcon Knight, and Berserker to pick up all the rally skills so that he can be my rally bot. To do this, he needs to S-support Selena to access Falcon Knight and A+ support Keaton to access the Berserker class. Similarly, I wanted Silas to be a ninja with soul for the Kitsune map, so he needed to level up in Hero and then support Kaze to get access to Ninja. In addition to supports limiting how difficult it is for certain units to get into certain classes, they also limit when you have access to them. If you want to get Berserker from Keaton, for example, you aren't doing it until at least a few chapters after his recruitment at the earliest. This is the most complex reclassing system I've talked about so far, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. The big con to this system is just that it can be a little overwhelming, especially on a first playthrough. It's difficult to plan your reclasses before you know what skills each class provides and how many units of each base class will be joining. So while planning your pairings and reclassing is really fun, You're limited in how much you can plan in a blind playthrough due to your lack of knowledge. A smaller issue is that by tying reclassing to supports, there's incentive to do pairings based on what reclasses they provide instead of pairing the units that you think will have interesting supports or be a cute pair. Some people won't mind this at all, and some will mind it a lot. It just depends how much you enjoy the matchmaking portion of Fire Emblem. The upsides of Fates' reclassing system, though, are pretty notable. Conquest is one of the most fun games to plan for in the series because there are so many decisions. Once you've decided what units you want, you have to decide what skills you want on each one, how they're going to get them, and how you're going to manage your seals to make sure you can do all the reclasses you want. It's pretty challenging, but in a way that's engaging and fun. The best part is towards the end of the game when your plans all come together and you get to enjoy your broken units that you put so much work into making. It's really rewarding, even though you can't really dig into all of the complexity on a first playthrough. After Fates, we move on to the Switch era with Three Houses, and Three Houses reclassing is unique due to the nature of the game. Since almost all of your units in Three Houses are students that you teach various skills throughout the game, any unit can end up in any class, barring exceptions like gender-locked classes or Lord-exclusive classes. Each class in Three Houses has certain skill requirements that you need to help your students meet in order for them to get into them. If you wanted Hilda to become a Wyvern, for example, you need to train her up in axes and flying so that she can pass her certification exam. Units can learn whatever skills you teach them, but they have some boons and banes that make them better or worse at learning specific skills. Dimitri, for example, has a bane in axes and a boon in lances. This makes it easier for him to increase his lance ability and get into classes that require high lance skills, while he struggles to get into the axe classes like Wyvern because he can't get his skill up as fast. Though units can end up in whatever class they want in Three Houses, there are a few things that help units feel unique anyway. One is personal skills, which return from previous Fire Emblems. These are passives that each unit have independent of their class. Ignatz' personal skill gives him extra accuracy, for example. Units also have different abilities that they unlock as their skills increase. Leone, for example, gets point-blank volley by training bows, which is one of the better combat arts in the game. Between personal skills and different unlockable abilities, units can perform pretty differently even in the same class. Bernadetta's Persecution Complex and Vengeance ability make her a great choice for low health builds, for example, because she can do a bunch of extra damage when she's injured. Other units might not be as suited for this role, which can lead them to play differently even if they're in similar classes. The reclassing system for Three Houses works very well given the theme of teaching a bunch of students and taking them from zero to hero, but it is let down a little bit by the class balance being very weak. People joke about Three Houses being all Wyvern spam, and while I think that's a bit exaggerated, there's some truth there. Tons of units want to be Wyverns, and a lot of the units that don't want to be Wyverns want to be a class that supports them, such as Warpers, Dancers, and Rallybots. While I do like the Three Houses reclassing system, it only really feels appropriate for settings such as Three Houses, where there's a big focus on teaching and training units. In a game with more established soldiers and veterans, it doesn't make as much sense to have things like a teaching phase or certification exams. I would love for this type of reclassing system to return at some point, perhaps with a more balanced class system, but I think you would need the right game to do it. It could be another school setting, but it doesn't have to be. Something like playing as a group of knights with squires in training could work just as well. Lastly, we have our most recent Fire Emblem game, Engage. In Engage, units can pretty easily reclass into whatever they want, and it's usually beneficial to do so after promoting, since reclassing resets your level. So if you reclass in an unpromoted class, you have to level back up to 10 before you get to promote, but if you're already promoted when you reclass, you can just shift into another promoted class. Like the 3DS games, you need a second seal to reclass, and they're pretty abundant after the early game. The only restriction on reclassing beyond needing a second seal is that you need the appropriate weapon proficiency to enter a new class. So if you wanted to become an axe sword wyvern in Engage, you need to be proficient in axes and swords. Fortunately, this is pretty easy. You can do it by just using emblems with those proficiencies in battle, or spending bond fragments to level an emblem up for a certain unit. For a lot of the game, you have access to many of the proficiencies, so reclassing basically just costs you a second seal and some bond fragments. Though there are some occasions where you're missing a certain proficiency for a while. Most notably, if you don't have DLC, you spend a lot of the mid-game without access to tome proficiencies, so you can't reclass into things like Sage or Mage Knight for a while. But for a lot of the game, it's fairly easy to get units into the classes you want them to be in. This is the game where unit individuality suffers the most from the reclassing system. There are personal skills in Engage, but many of them are not terribly impactful, so a given unit's power is mostly determined by just their stats, class, and emblem ring. Two units with similar stats don't feel very distinct from each other. On the flip side, this means that you can always use your favorite units, but have a different experience each time by changing their class. The restrictionless reclassing is also great for funny challenge runs. I've seen a lot of people do things like Sage-only runs or backup unit-only runs, which would be more difficult or impossible in other Fire Emblem games. You wouldn't even be able to do this in flexible reclassing systems like Shadow Dragon because that game places a restriction on how many units of each class you can have. Engage also dialed back the skill system from Fates. Classes still give a skill, but units don't get to keep it when they reclass into another class. So you don't have to do things like hop between a bunch of classes just to pick up skills for a build like you do in Awakening and Fates. This can be a pro or a con depending on how much you enjoy that planning aspect in Fates, but I think Engage hits a nice sweet spot of being interesting without being overwhelming. One other limitation of the flexible reclassing that's on display in Engage is that it becomes a little more difficult to make units that are unusual for their base class. Take a unit like Anna. Anna is an axe fighter with a great magic growth, and in a game without reclassing, that would be pretty unique. An axe fighter that wants to use magic weapons like the Radiant Bow. In practice, though, you can just reclass her into Mage Knight. So instead of her weird stat line for her class being something interesting for you to figure out, you just reclass her into a class where her stat line isn't weird. I think this is an unfortunate limitation that prevents some unusual but interesting unit designs from flourishing. Something that really benefits Engage's reclassing system, though, is that the class balance is quite good. Like Three Houses, Engage has a bit of a reputation for having a Wyvern meta, but I think that's much less true in Engage than it is in Three Houses. A lot of units like Wyvern, but classes like Griffin Knight, Warrior, Hero, Bow Knight, Sage, and more are all great and often better than Wyvern for certain units. Figuring out the best class for each unit for your team composition is one of the most fun parts of Engage's reclassing system, and the class balance being good is part of why it works so well. The flexible reclassing of Engage would be way less effective if there was an obvious best class that everyone wanted to be, but really lots of units have multiple options, and you'll probably be using a decent variety of classes in your playthroughs. So that's all the reclassing systems in Fire Emblem, and to be honest, I like most of them, and wouldn't mind seeing any of them return in some form. My favorites are Engage's super flexible reclassing system, which makes it easy to use any unit you please in whatever role you want. It's a fun system to think about, but it's not so complex that it hurts my brain, and I think it's really easy to wrap your head around even on the first playthrough. Fate's reclassing is complex and more challenging to optimize than other reclassing system, but also feels really rewarding when you see your plan come together, which makes me like that system a lot too. Lastly, Sacred Stone-style reclassing ensures that units feel very distinct from each other, while still allowing a few avenues for player choice and customization. I think it would be a great reclassing system if the class choices were just a wee bit more balanced. However, even though I do have some favorite reclassing systems, I like that Fire Emblem experiments with it. I hope that they continue to give us different reclassing systems and iterate on successful ones, and also that maybe they give us a return to more limited reclassing systems from time to time, even if it has to come in the form of remakes in between more flexible reclassing systems. So that's what I think about all the reclassing systems in Fire Emblem. But what do you think? Which system is your favorite and why? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments or in our community Discord, which is linked in the video description. And if you liked the video and you want to see more things like it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you don't miss an upload, and have yourself an awesome week.